Okay, let's continue our discussion of virtue ethics and review what we've already learned. First of all, virtue ethics, of course, is a universalist theory, meaning, as Aristotle maintains, that virtue is a good thing for anyone to pursue and to embody, despite the culture or environment within which you find yourself. Becoming virtuous is a path toward what everybody ultimately wants, to be happy. And we saw that for Aristotle, happiness does not signify a momentary disposition that comes and goes, but rather an enduring sense of well-being. The virtuous person knows how to conduct him or herself in any situation. A virtuous character will almost habitually or instinctively know the proper way to deal with emotions and feelings. And of course, that is the point. Virtue allows us to convert afflictive emotions like anger, jealousy, hatred, depression, fear, desire, into fruitful action. Action which will engender flourishing. So happiness for Aristotle means well-being and flourishing. Okay? And understood that way, for Aristotle, happiness is a rational end to strive for. Because well-being is an end in itself. The value of happiness is intrinsic. That is, its value is not sought outside of itself. The value of happiness is intrinsic. It is its own reward. And because for Aristotle, rationality means the operation of our mind at the highest order of thinking. That is, thinking for the sake of thinking, for its intrinsic value. Happiness is the proper end for a human being. Okay? Now we saw that although there are many virtues, a plethora of character dispositions which we could call virtuous, for the ancient Greeks, all of them ultimately arise from four cardinal virtues: justice, temperance, courage, and piety. Okay? And what makes these character dispositions virtuous is that they are the mean between extreme ways of behaving. Okay? Virtue is a mean between extremes. And so we demonstrated how this works. In the case of the emotion of fear, which is an afflictive emotion, it can cause disturbance, as Epictetus taught. And also, as Epictetus taught, it is not simply the emotion or what happens to us that determines our well-being or ill-being, but rather the judgment that we make about it. Likewise, for Aristotle, it is our response to the emotion that determines whether we flourish or stagnate, whether we are truly free or become a slave of our emotions and feelings. So, given fear, the virtue which deals with it is courage. But if I have a deficiency of courage, then I'm a coward. Cowardice is a deficiency. And thus a vice. And the opposite problem would be something like recklessness. Which is also a vice, not because it is deficient, but because it is excessive. It is too much of a good thing. So courage lies in the mean. It is a mean between extreme ways of being. And in each case, whether I am cowardly or simply reckless, I have allowed the afflictive emotion, in this case fear, to rule over me. Okay? Either I almost reflexively respond to it by rushing headlong against it, or I retreat from it. But for the person that has learned courage, just the right amount of resistance to that fear provides me the opportunity to flourish and to cultivate that sense of well-being. The emotions which can undermine my well-being become opportunities for growth, for flourishing. Okay, and likewise, we could do the same thing with any of the virtues. Okay? Like piety. What would be the feeling, the emotion, the appetite that piety deals with? Maybe pride. Okay? Or arrogance, something like that, right? If I am deficient in piety, then perhaps I have fallen prey to the illusion that I am completely self-sufficient, that I myself am a god. Yet, if I have too much piety, then perhaps I err in the other direction, believing that I can't accomplish anything on my own. Okay? That I must wait and pray for someone or something else to come along to save me. So again, piety, like courage, lies in the mean. But he calls this mean itself an extreme. Virtue is an extreme way of existing. Because in order to be virtuous, I have to enter into the breach. I must confront the emotion which threatens to undermine my well-being. Okay? Or temperance. If I am deficient in temperance and have a desire for something, I will either attempt to dominate it or to possess it entirely, to eat the entire birthday cake. Okay? But if I am excessive in temperance, we would call that something like asceticism. Okay? To be ascetic is to be radically self-denying, self-abnegation. I deny myself everything because I fear that if I allow myself to be exposed, even for a moment, to the object of my appetite or desire, then I will become a slave to it, that it will overpower me. Becoming virtuous is to empower oneself to meet our feelings with the correct disposition of character to engender well-being and flourishing. In a word, happiness. Okay? But we also saw that although it is good for anyone, universally, to be virtuous, virtue is, nevertheless, relative to the individual. Not in the sense that there are people for whom the virtues would not lead to happiness, but in the sense that there are differences between us. We do not all begin in the same place. If I have a fear of bugs, okay, then I am going to have to summon the same degree of courage to confront a single insect that another person may have to summon to lay in an entire tank filled with bugs. So from the outside, it may look like one person is more courageous or more temperate, more pious, more just than another person. But we cannot make that judgment without knowing where they began. Okay? Now, I find this insight that virtue is a mean between extremes, a character trait that is good for anyone universally to have, but is nevertheless relative to the individual. to have a great deal of explanatory power. Okay? Because consider this. What if I'm an alcoholic? Okay? And I know, knowing myself as I do, and remember Socrates counseled us always to seek self-knowledge. If I know that having even one drink will spell disaster for me, okay? Either because I carry an alcoholic gene or the circumstances of my upbringing and early development have led me down the path of alcoholism, then perhaps temperance, in my case, means not drinking at all. And someone who doesn't understand that might mock me and say, oh, have you so little control over yourself, over your desires, that you can't even have one drink and act like a normal human being? Okay? So what would excessive temperance look like for a person who can't even have one drink?
Like not going to a bar with their friends.
Right, yeah. Okay? I mean, I may know that I myself cannot safely have a drink. But does that mean that I can't go into a bar room and order something else and still converse with my friends? Or worse, does it mean that I become the alcohol Nazi and try to impose my own restrictions on everyone else around me?
It works both ways. Some end up doing that, and some actually go to bars and feed their siblings.
It could. Okay.
I hate the ones that when they have open call and they just look at everybody else another way.
Yeah.
Now that's the problem.
That's so annoying.
If I attempt to impose what the mean is for myself upon everyone else around me, then I have become excessive. Okay? Even piety. Excessive piety is what we call religious fanaticism. It's not enough for me to feel my own relative insignificance in the face of the divine and to pay proper homage to the God of my understanding. I have to impose my belief system upon everyone else, and anyone who doesn't believe the way that I believe will suffer. Okay? Or think about someone who has quit smoking and then vilifies anybody else who does. Okay?
Would you say it was called spiritual fanaticism?
Yeah, or religious fanaticism, you know? Okay, so I think we understand what it means to say that virtue is a mean between extremes, but it is a mean which is relative to us. Okay.
Says extreme mean.
It is a mean which is itself an extreme, right? Because I have to confront the object of my affliction and become master over my own emotions rather than allowing my emotions to master me. Okay? So virtue is good because it leads to happiness. And perhaps in time I may even discover that virtue is itself happiness. That it is its own reward. And happiness, we saw, is a rational end because its value is intrinsic. But Aristotle has also said that not only are we rational animals, but we are also social animals. And the social side of our nature gives us an insight into how one becomes virtuous. Virtue is learned. We are not born with it. We learn it by imitating others. If I see that the people who seem to have a sense of enduring well-being, and I think you know the kind of person I'm talking about, someone who just seems to know how to comport him or herself in any situation, someone who can convert adversity to a triumph. And I want what they have. If I want that sense of well-being, if I want that ability to flourish under any circumstances, then I simply imitate what they do. If you want what they have, then do what they do. Okay? So we learn virtue by imitating virtuous people and then practicing it. And Aristotle calls that practice habituation. Virtue is learned by imitation and habituation. And of course, we will fail time and again as we attempt to internalize these virtues, to become virtuous. You wouldn't call someone who occasionally is temperate, but for the most part errs either on the side of deficiency or excess, a temperate person. The temperate person will always be temperate. The courageous person will always be courageous. And so it takes time to habituate ourselves. But once we do, then we no longer even have to think about it. We will automatically know what the correct response to our feelings is. Okay? And because learning virtue is a social phenomenon, one advantage of virtue theory, okay, is that I do not have to believe, let's say, in the existence of a divinity. I do not have to understand a complex moral system, such as we will encounter later down the line in somebody like Immanuel Kant. I can learn what it means to be virtuous by reading great literature, by watching films, by reading epic tales. Okay? There are examples of virtue all around us. And another one of the advantages that our textbook author, Mazzoni, cites to virtue theory is that it employs what he calls thick concepts. Like if I were just to say to you, hey, do your duty, or seek the mean between extremes. These are not particularly revealing. But if I talk to you in terms like treachery, jealousy, bravery, okay, these are thicker concepts. And we understand in a more visceral way what it means to be courageous or temperate, pious or just. Okay? Another advantage is that virtue ethics can handle cultural relativism. And I discussed this last time with the example of the people whose rite of passage is to wear the bullet ant gloves. Okay? What counts as courageous, what counts as an act of piety in one culture may look very different from another culture. But that doesn't mean that there is not a common principle lying beneath those differences. You will not find a culture that thinks courage is a bad thing or temperance is a bad thing. Although the way courage or temperance or piety manifest themselves may look very different from one culture to the next, just as it may look very different from one person to the next. So virtue ethics can accommodate or make room for the fact that different cultures do indeed have different practices, standards, and values, but nonetheless share a common reverence for virtuous behavior. So it retains its universality. But if I were to say that because different cultures have different standards, practices, and values, it follows that there is no truth in ethics. There is no objective standard of good behavior. For the virtue theorist, that goes too far. That would be an exaggeration. Okay? Okay. I also should point out to you that the idea of the mean is not the exclusive property of the ethicist. For the ancient Greeks, there was a principle of the golden mean, okay, or the golden ratio. And it actually has a numerical value. It's 1 point something or other, which I can't remember offhand, 1.67 something. And what the Greeks discovered is that wherever we find beauty, balance, harmony, this ratio is present. It somehow resonates with us. Okay? And so, virtue ethics is consistent with the way the Greeks thought about beauty, truth. All right. Now, one last thing I'd like to do, in addition to talking about the advantages of the virtue ethic, of which there are obviously many, It is relative to the individual, right? So it can handle the differences between people, differences between culture. It is readily learnable by the imitation of those who we perceive as happy in the Aristotelian sense. It employs thick concepts. We also, to be fair, ought to consider some of the possible disadvantages. Now, in the textbook, there are basically two, neither of which I lend much credence to. Okay? One of them is that it is unclear which virtue one ought to focus on. If we say that courage is a virtue, piety, temperance, justice, and the multiplicity of virtues which arise from those cardinal ones, where do I begin? Do I first seek to become courageous or temperate or pious? Okay? So the objection is that it is unclear which virtue to begin with. In response to this, first of all, I'd like to remind you that Plato insisted on the idea that the virtues form a unity. That it is impossible to have one of the virtues without also having some share in all of the virtues. I cannot be pious unless I am also courageous. I cannot be courageous unless I am also temperate. I cannot be temperate unless I am also just. And while, given one's particular circumstance, the vocation of an individual, perhaps one of these virtues may play a more prominent role. For example, the virtue which is paramount, let's say for a first responder, okay, a police officer or a paramedic, a firefighter, might be courage, okay? Whereas for a healthcare worker, a doctor, a nurse practitioner, it may be compassion, patience, okay? Our vocations and circumstances will naturally evoke the proper virtue. And in practicing those virtues, we will naturally be practicing the others. Okay. The second possible objection or disadvantage to virtue ethics cited by Mazzoni in the book is that ethics is ordinarily thought of as being about how I treat other people. I ought to be just in my relations with others, temperate in the company of others. And yet, virtue ethics, from the start, is concerned with one's own happiness. Remember, the justification for saying one ought to become virtuous is that virtue is the corridor to happiness. Whose happiness? Mine, my well-being, my flourishing. And so the objection is perhaps this is too egocentric of a theory. But in response to that, I would say, how could it be possible to become a just or temperate, courageous or pious person and not have that impact the way I treat others? If I become just, I will not simply do justice to myself. I will naturally do justice to all of those around me. Okay? And certainly one traditional mark of a good ethical theory is that it is impartial, that it regards the self as equal to the other. And so, while of course I am concerned for my own well-being, my well-being cannot exist in a vacuum. It is naturally interwoven with the well-being of others. Remember that the idea that virtue is the good. To be a good person, to live a good life, is to live a virtuous life. Arises from Aristotle's conception of human nature. Human nature is rational and social animality. Okay? We are social by nature. And so it would be impossible for me to be virtuous regarding my own affairs and not in the affairs that involve others. Okay? So again, I don't think that this objection is viable, although you should bear it in mind, okay? Especially when taking the quiz. If I were to ask you, which of the following is not an advantage or a perceived advantage of virtue ethics, the answer would be that it focuses directly on the welfare of others, okay? Because presumably it begins by focusing on my own welfare. But we do say things like, I can't possibly love another person until I learn to love myself, right? I can't treat others justly unless I have learned to do justice to myself. To do justice to myself is to be virtuous. If I overindulge and thus am not temperate, if I flee from every object of fear and thus am not courageous, if I try to shoulder the entire world by myself and never recognize that I need others, and perhaps a spiritual element in my life, then I have failed in piety. Okay? So to do justice to myself is to live up to what it means to be a human being, to be rational. And to be rational means to understand the reason why I do things. to understand that the value of money or power or reputation is not dominating others or intrinsic. That the value of these things is simply a means to what is truly valuable. My sense of well-being and my ability to weather any storm with the proper response. Okay? Always remember, virtue exists in order to channel my feelings toward appropriate action. Okay? It is the moderator between emotion and action.
Virtues.
Yes. Now, virtue ethics is really about becoming a certain kind of person. Okay? Because I'm not going to know necessarily in advance of any given situation what the proper response is going to be, because I don't know what situations I may find myself in. Okay? But because virtue ethics is about developing a certain type of character, then no matter what situation I find myself in, I bring that character to bear and can turn any situation into an opportunity to flourish. Okay? All right. So, does anybody have any questions? And let's at least conclude our discussion of virtue ethics for the time being by answering the 4 questions posed by Mazzoni for any virtue, for any ethical tradition. What is the origin of ethics, according to the virtue theorists? Where does it originate? Yes, human nature. Okay? All people seek their own happiness. Everybody wants to flourish. Everyone seeks well-being. And so it's a very honest theory. It doesn't ask you to believe in an unseen deity who prescribes commandments. The origin of ethics is human nature and society. We learn it by imitating others. What is human nature? It is rational and social. What about the question of relativism? Well, virtue ethics certainly can accommodate cultural relativism. It can easily explain the differences between cultures. But ethical relativism would be an exaggeration. Right. I mean, each culture may emphasize a different way of being courageous or temperate or pious. I mean, just think about the different ways that different religions manifest piety. Okay? For one religion, it might be fasting. Another, it might be praying at a certain time during the day. And another, it might involve some sort of ritual sacrifice. Okay? But to conclude on the basis of these superficial differences that there isn't a universal appreciation for the virtue of piety would be an exaggeration. Virtue is a universal good, even though it may be practiced differently from culture to culture or person to person. And as far as the practical question goes, of what makes an action right or wrong? Well, simply a character trait is virtuous if it contributes to happiness, understood as well-being and flourishing. Okay? There's a learning curve here. I imitate others whom I perceive to be virtuous, but of course, because I'm different than you, there are subjective differences from person to person. I may have to adjust and learn what it means for me to hit the meat. Okay? I like virtue ethics. I think it is intuitive. It is empowering. Okay? And it is proven. You will live a better life if you have learned courage. You will live a better life if you have learned temperance and some form of piety. Even respect for your elders is an offshoot of piety. Okay? And certainly justice. On the other hand, if I have not learned these virtues, if every time I desire something, I indulge to the point of satiety or sickness, if every time I'm afraid, I run away, then I'm going to suffer. And I'm going to be a slave to those emotions. So, in virtue ethics, as in, I would say, most if not all of the traditions which we're going to consider, what is really at issue here is human freedom. A good life is a free life, because that's what we really are. We are self-directed beings. I have the power to choose my own way, to stand on a principle, despite all of the factors which may seek to divert me from the good. To become virtuous is to empower oneself to be free despite emotions and circumstances that would otherwise enslave me. So again, I remind you that this course, in which our guiding question is, what does it mean to live a good life, is about living a good life. It is not about simply digesting the history of ethics. It is about considering what thoughtful people over the last 2,000 years have thought about what it means to be good, and to do so critically. And it may be the case that we go through the entire semester and none of these theories really completely resonates with you. But one thing I do want you to learn is that when talking about good and bad, we do not have to be relegated to the level of our subjective opinions. We do not have to believe this falsehood that what is good for me is good for me, and what's good for you is good for you. That it is possible for us to think and talk rationally about human behavior, to inquire. Okay? And the idea here always, of course, is to consult our common sense intuitions about right and wrong, because we have them. We have a sense of what is right and what is wrong. And there are cases in which the right thing to do is obvious. But there are many cases in which it is not obvious at all. So what we're doing, in one sense, in ethical theory, is attempting to discover the principle upon which we make those easy judgments. Like nobody, hopefully, in here would argue with me when I say that it is wrong to torture innocent children. Okay? Now, if we can agree upon that and ask, why is it wrong to do that? What is the principle that makes it wrong? Then, perhaps we can take that principle and apply it in the more difficult cases, like abortion or mercy killing, famine relief, capital punishment. Okay? We are searching for a proper understanding of the meaning of goodness. And it may be at the end that all of the traditions give us an insight, that none of them has a monopoly on what it means to live a good life. What I want us to learn here is how to think critically about what we ought to do as human beings. The question is not simply, what should I do in this situation or that situation? The deeper question is, what ought I to do at all in my humanity? Okay? So again, although this course is ethics, it's impossible to think about what it means to be good without also thinking about what it means to be a person at all. I can't know if a thing is good or bad unless I know what it is to be that sort of thing. Okay? So while we are doing ethics, we are also doing metaphysics. We are asking about the reality of the human condition. What is human nature? Okay? And that is not an ethical question itself. It's more of a metaphysical question. when I seek the reality of human existence. But I can't do ethics without venturing into that metaphysical territory. All right. So I believe that we will have a quiz over virtue ethics in the immediate future. Remember, tonight at 11:59 p.m., your quiz over Epictetus, universalism and relativism is due. And it may be tomorrow that the virtue ethic quiz gets posted, okay? I can consult our calendar here. It's Thursday? Okay. So Thursday, I guess. Thursday, 11:59 p.m. is when your virtue ethic quiz will be due. Okay? And you may have noticed, if you've already taken the quiz, that I've extended the time a little bit, 25 minutes rather than 15.
That was nice.
Okay.
I take my time.
I mean, I had a student request that, and I said, well, why not do it for everybody? Okay. All right, now don't forget that you have a reading assignment for tomorrow. We're leaving virtue ethics.
And it's Kant.
It's not. We're not doing Kant yet.
I know.
Yeah, but no. The next section is on natural law theory. Okay.
I just missed 3 days last week. I just can't miss it.